In this third course to steer example, we're looking at the same scenario. At 9:30 we're in this position here, and we're trying to get to this position here. The difference in this case is we're looking at a much slower boat, a boat travelling at just 6 knots. So this distance here is going to take somewhere in the region of 2 hours. So we have to allow for 2 hours of tide. You can see we've left the first hour of tide on from the previous example, and we've still left on the same initial line. Going back to this tide, this is the first hour of tide. We now need to draw from this end point a second hour of tide onto that point. We've worked out that the second hour of tide is going to be 296. So we take our plotter and we turn it to 296. In the same way as before, we present that to the chart and we line the arrows and the lines on the bezel up with the north lines on the chart, like so. We then move it down until the outside edge is lined up with the end of the tidal vector, or the first hour of tide, and we can then draw in that direction following the arrow. So we've got the direction of that second hour of tide. We now just need to know how far that tide would have taken us. Now the tidal flow in that second hour was 3.6 knots, so it would have taken us in 1 hour 3.6 nautical miles, which again we measure, and from the end of the first tidal vector out along this new line we measure that distance and we mark that point. Again, we mark it with 3 arrows. We can rub out any excess line so we don't confuse ourselves later. The final task is to mark on the distance we would have travelled. Now this boat would have travelled at 6 knots, so in 2 hours it would have travelled 12 nautical miles. So we set the dividers to 12 nautical miles, like so. As we have done before, we put one end of the dividers at the end of, in this case, the 2 sets of tidal vectors, and we, like as if we were using a compass, we arc off until we meet the course line. Once we've found that when those 2 points meet, we mark that point. Now with a straight edge, in this case the plotter, we draw a line between the end of the tidal vectors and the line we've just drawn or arced off along the course line, like so. We mark that with 1 arrow. This is our course to steer. As we've done before, we line up our plotter, we turn the bezel so that the arrows and the lines line up with the north on the chart. We can then read off the figure, in this case 80 degrees. So our course to steer is 80 degrees true. We can then go on to adjust for variation and allow for leeway.